I open this hearing of the Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport References Committee into the shutdown of the 3G mobile network. For the benefit of witnesses, I am the Chair, Senator Matthew Canavan, and I'm joined today by the Deputy Chair, Senator Sterle. I know Senator Brown is just outside, and I think some other senators might come along too. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence. Witnesses also have a right to be heard in camera. Before we start, I'd like to remind everyone these are official parliamentary proceedings and a Hansard record is being prepared. The discussions are being broadcast. If a witness objects to answering a question, they should state the ground on which they object, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer having regard to the ground on which it is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that their answer be given in camera. I remind all senators that as Chair, I'll ensure these proceedings are conducted in a dignified, courteous, fair and respectful way, consistent with their obligations under the Behaviour Code for Australian parliamentarians. And I'd also, well, I don't think we've got anyone coming from teleconference today, do we? Okay, so we don't need that one. And I now welcome representatives from the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communications and the Arts. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses has been provided to you. Now, normally I'd ask you to state your names, but I think we also need to remind senators that we have resolved that we will not ask an officer of the Commonwealth to give an opinion on a matter of policy, and they shall be given a reasonable opportunity to refer questions to other officers or to a minister. So now for the Hansard record, could you please state your names and the capacity in which you appear? I might start with you, Mr. Grunhard.
Thank you, Chair. Sam Grunhard, First Assistant Secretary, Communication Services and Consumer Division.
Good morning, Senators. James Chisholm, Deputy Secretary, Communications and Media, Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communications and the Arts, maybe hereafter referred to as the Department.
Cool. Yeah. Yes, easier. Cool.
Hello, Lisa Rance. I'm the First Assistant Secretary, Communications Infrastructure Division.
Great.
Good morning, Shanyn Sparreboom, Assistant Secretary, Competition and Spectrum Branch.
All right, well, thanks for coming back. We obviously had the hearing last week. We have a few follow-up questions, and we also have your submission, although I think that might be from a while ago. Would you like to make any opening statement, or do we want to go straight to questions?
No, thank you, Senator.
Okay, well, let's go straight to questions. Look, I suppose the fundamental thing that's happened since the shutdown is and I'm sure yourselves are getting a lot of complaints that coverage has disappeared since the 3G shutdown. What is your assessment or understanding of the coverage map in Australia since the shutdown of the 3G network?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. We have been monitoring closely the situation with respect to coverage maps and feedback from consumers about whether or not they are receiving the coverage that was promised to them as part of the transition. We were pleased to hear that the MNOs last week, Optus and Telstra, restated their commitment to providing coverage for anybody that fell within a coverage map that they said would be available to people prior to the shutdown, and that moreover the coverage would be stronger, at least equivalent, but better, which is a key element of the benefit of this transition to use stronger frequency and all of the communications benefits that come from that. So the Minister, in that respect, has written to the companies, Telstra and Optus, to highlight some of the comments and concerns that have been expressed by some consumers and ask for responses from them. And we have also instituted or reinstituted regular reporting on complaint numbers and how those things are being handled. And that also should be seen in the context of some of the stronger regulatory responses that have been put in place since the beginning of this process to better manage these sorts of transitions. So I guess in summary, Senator, we will be monitoring those very closely and are working with industry to ensure that they are resolved speedily, and the Minister is taking a very strong level of interest
Okay, so when did the Minister write to the MNOs?
Last week, yes.
After the hearing?
Before the hearing.
Before the hearing, okay,
Yeah.
thank you. When is the response expected?
I'll just check
Or
on
was
when
there
we
a
expect,
ask to
the
get
response.
back to-
Yeah.
I'm not sure when we'll expect a response from the CEOs of Telstra and Optus, but weekly reporting will commence next week. We should get data for this week, as well as going back to the beginning of the shutdown as well.
Okay, thank you.
And Senator, I'll just add to, I think Ms Sparreboom might have mentioned this, but yeah, the Minister has asked for the reporting to commence by 10th of February, weekly reporting.
This is on the coverage or the complaints or
The
both?
complaints, which
Yep, okay.
are really centred around the coverage-related complaints and how they're being
Okay.
resolved.
So have you got the first report from them? The 10th was Monday?
We haven't received a report yet.
Okay.
We expect to receive a report early next week reflecting this last week and
Okay.
going back to the 28th of
Okay,
October.
all right. Just going back to my original question though, I mean, do we have an understanding of what the coverage is in the country?
I'll just ask one of my colleagues to talk about the nature of the coverage maps. Yeah.
Senator, the coverage and understanding whether the maps demonstrate people's lived experience is something that we're very interested in. As Mr Chisholm said, there is the commitment to coverage being at least equivalent to what people have had. In the hearings last week, there was some reference made to a national audit of mobile coverage. That's underway and data's starting to come in on that. The roads and static locations that are included in that have been chosen based on feedback from states and territories and from what we've observed in terms of people asking or raising concerns about coverage in particular locations. So that will give us a clearer picture on whether the experience of people is reflecting what's on the maps.
Right. So when did this audit? This is an audit. That was your word, I think. When did this audit begin?
So it commenced last year in May 2024 with a pilot.
Right.
The audit proper, I guess, and the data is starting to flow from it more this year. On our website, and we're happy to provide links or anything that's useful, the data is being shown there, and you can sort of go in and have a look at the coverage maps. It's also supplemented by crowdsourced data, which has about 165,000 users, and it just starts to give you a bit more richness when you look at those maps with what the experience of people using mobiles in those locations is.
Right. Okay. When do we expect the results of that?
So it's a rolling audit that's over a 3-year period. We're getting a lot of interest in it. As I said, the data is, depending on the kind of data that it is, going up monthly or quarterly. So it'll just keep getting richer as we're going. We're also not waiting until we've completed that audit process, where as soon as we're getting information that demonstrates that the experience of people is different from the map, we're feeding it back through the mobile network operators. We're also using it to inform the design and prioritisation of the programs that the department's responsible for.
Right.
And just to add to what Ms Rance said, Senator, this is the first of its kind for the government to support independent audit of mobile coverage. And, you know, to date we've been reliant on industry maps. And as you'd be aware, sometimes as Ms Rance said, lived experience of people compared with those maps can be different. So it's a rolling audit. The information is being made available publicly.
Yep, it's on our website.
It's on the website, and we will be using that to inform our own monitoring of things like the 3G transition, but also programs that we're responsible for, like mobile network hardening. base stations, because if the issues are showing the gaps, then sometimes it's a matter of some of the infrastructure that just needs to be updated or built in areas that are underserved at the moment.
Right. I think you mentioned it would help, these maps would help compare or at least ground truth, I suppose, the commitment the MNOs have made and whether they're meeting that. Although I do wonder what is the baseline here? What are you going to be comparing it against? Because we presumably haven't got a lived experience map from before the 3G shutdown, or at least not a comprehensive one by the sound of it?
Yeah, good question. And it's not like for like. So there is crossover, but we are reliant on certain roads that are being driven on to undertake the audit. For example, we're using Australia Post vehicles, which is part of the portfolio, right, to undertake a lot of that.
But my key question is not so much how you're doing it, it's do you have data from those Australia Post vehicles prior to the 3G shutdown to then compare against whether...
Sorry, Mr Chisholm. There's a couple of things there. There are the 3G coverage maps. And I understand Telstra's...
When you just to be clear, because there's lots of maps now, you're saying when you say those, they're the ones produced by Telstra and Optus.
Right. And I think what we're trying to focus on is the experience in location. So not just whether someone has different coverage to what they had before, but whether they have coverage and the quality of that coverage, like, whether it is intermittent or... So the audit sort of classifies the coverage into, I think it's 3 categories, but we can provide that for you.
Right.
It's highlighting coverage issues in parts of our big cities as well. But so Senator, I was trying to be clear there that we will still be relying on what industry has said they will cover as part of this transition. So it was made very clear to everybody that coverage maps that would fall within the 4G, 5G coverage maps would apply. So our view is they should apply. And if there are consumers who are saying that they are within those coverage maps and having issues, then as the industry representative said last week, they should be receiving coverage.
Yes. So I just want to go there and clarify exactly what the nature of this commitment is. So I think earlier said the commitment, I think you hinted at, Ms Rance, that if you had coverage before, we should get it again. My understanding, though, of what Telstra and Optus are saying is that if you had coverage on our map, we're guaranteeing that. They're kind of claiming that if you had some coverage and you weren't on that map, that's just fortuitous and bad luck. You're not necessarily going to get it post-shutdown. Do you understand what I'm saying? Is that what's your assessment, particularly of those people outside the 3G map footprint prior to the shutdown, but still got coverage? Is your understanding of what Telstra Optus is saying is that those people deserve to continue to have coverage?
I think the view that industry's conveyed there is that if they fell outside the coverage map, then they're not within the...
They're outside their guarantee.
Was that...
I think it is. But because the audit is coming at it through a slightly different lens, which is where are people getting good coverage and where aren't they? An example might be useful. The National Farmers Federation referred to the Warrego Highway, and we've started to get data in on that. The majority of the road has good coverage, and we've got a definition of good in the guidelines for the audit. There are some patches where, which is not like for an individual, if you're driving along and there's a patch that is not good. The crowdsourced data and the audit data support that there are coverage issues in those points, and you can see it when you go onto the map. And we'll be working with MNOs to make sure there's an understanding of that and to, get advice on what can be done. And as Mr Chisholm said, we're also feeding that back through to programs because it might be something that there is a solution that fits within the scope of one of
Can I just ask, is that an example of where they had promised coverage, these gaps were previously within the 3G maps?
No, this is not focusing on. The audit isn't about checking specifically 3G versus what's now.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Look, before I hand over to others, I just want to say it's all well and good that we maybe have some assessment of the performance against the commitment, but what are the consequences if they don't? And it does look that, at least in some cases, people aren't benefiting from the commitment to maintain coverage. What happens then? Is there any assessment here or thoughts going into making the industry make good people, helping them buy boosters and these sort of things, which they are being asked to do? We heard last week that Telstra and Optus are telling their customers, oh, you might want to invest in a booster, but these could be $10,000, $15,000, we were told. Is there any thought being given to, well, we should make Telstra and Optus make good on their commitment?
Is this with respect to the people who fall outside those maps?
Well, either or. But obviously there are cases that are clearer, where if you're in the map and you're now not getting coverage or not really good coverage, there seems to be people who just, they're dropping in and out all the time, so it's not useful coverage, that are within the old 3G maps, the Telstra or Optus maps. Clearly that's a clear example where they were guaranteed coverage and they're not getting it. And then there's others that were getting coverage, so-called fortuitous coverage. But in both cases, are there thoughts being given to making Telstra and Optus come to the party here? Because otherwise they just made a statement to us, switch off the network and walk away. I mean, what's the consequences here for them for not meeting their commitment?
Well, Senator, in that regard, our understanding is that there should be no issue with respect to signal propagation between the transition between 3G and 4G and 5G. So, as I said earlier, if industry is committed to that coverage being there post-transition, then they will be making good on that commitment. And that is why the Minister has asked them to provide reporting and information in response to the complaints. You also had the opportunity
My question is exactly how they'll be making good.
And then you had the opportunity to talk to ACMA and the ACCC last week. And I expect that there will be an interest in how that transition rolls out and how those complaints are responded to in the context of their responsibilities.
Like if Telstra and Optus say, yeah, we're going to make good, and they just drag people out and they don't offer anything real, what is the penalties that can be applied to them?
So
for
frequently a first recourse.
People about this?
Frequently a first recourse in these situations is to talk to the Ombudsman. We have spoken to the Ombudsman, the Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman, about complaints, and they are providing information to us about whether they're seeing a spike in complaints. Consumers also have the opportunity to speak to fair trading agencies about representations made to them, and existing laws cover that.
Just one more question, actually. Sorry, this should be a quick one before I hand over. They told us last week, Telstra and Optus told us last week, that their actual footprint has grown. They believe they've covered more of the country now than before the 3G shutdown, even though maybe there are different areas being covered. Do you accept that? Do you agree? Do you believe, or are you able to yourselves ground truth their claims that more of the country is now covered?
I think that's part of the reason we're undertaking the further analysis. We want to see, it's early, but in general, the transition appears to have been very successful with respect to the vast majority of people. So
what's your understanding of, do you know how they're making that judgment? Do they themselves have an audit like a truck going around or something that says, okay, there's coverage in this area, we'll put that on our map? Or are these just modelled? Do they just sort of project how much a cell tower can cover?
I might just check with my colleagues on the technical aspects of how they might verify some of that. Yeah.
Through the information provided from Telstra, they provide us quarterly reports on the transition progress. Part of that included information on how they were testing coverage. They were using not only the predictive coverage sort of maps that they currently use, but also they engaged an independent auditor to do drive-by testings, and that's how they signed off specific sites as being equivalent. And in August, which was the last sort of quarterly report that we received, they'd signed off 98% of the total network as having coverage equivalency, and they were confident that the remaining 2% would be there as well. Okay. And so there was an independent audit drive-by surveys that they were undertaking as well.
All right, well, thank you for that. I'll pass over to the Deputy Chair.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just a quick one. So eventually, we're going to come to the stage where 4G and 5G will shut down, and we've heard what's been happening and how we're trying to improve things. But what else have we learnt that we could make it smoother for the next transition?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Senator. So and in previous evidence to this committee and also in other hearings, we've talked about the fact that this transition kicked off in 2019. That was when MNOs began to notify government of their plans. And I think it's fair to say, looking at this, the focus for a long time was on coverage equivalence, which is the sort of issue that we're talking about here today. And that's an important issue. It's critical. But just as critical are questions that have come up previously about 000 and public safety. And that is an issue that the government has invested heavily in as part of this transition. In fact, its most fundamental commitment has been to focus on public safety. And I think none of the people at this table were there at the start. And we have come in and sort of looked at this, and I think the best way to describe it is that it's not an orderly transition under the current regulatory framework. It is now a much more orderly process based on some of the changes that the government has introduced. There is a strong role for government in both ensuring that agencies like ACMA have the tools available to enforce regulatory compliance with things like 000 requirements, so that is now in place. There's also a very strong role for government in raising awareness and working closely with industry to ensure that consumers are aware of what is happening and what they need to do to ensure that they are ready for that transition. So a good example of that is all of the Internet of Things devices we've talked about before. Medical devices, unmonitored medical devices, lift phones, trucking equipment. There's quite a vast array of devices now that are dependent on these technologies. And then even within mobile handsets themselves, the sheer volume of handsets and the differences between them suggests that we should have been a lot earlier zeroing in on that issue. But as we've said in previous hearings, it only became clearer to us that that was an issue in late 2023, early 2024. And that was because there isn't a lot of control about the handsets that come into the country, or there hasn't been. A lot of them are bought on the grey market. They might comply with regulatory requirements in other jurisdictions, but they weren't fit for purpose as part of this transition. And some of those handsets are the ones that now would not be compliant with the requirements that ACMA is enforcing in relation to 000. So I think the key lesson there, in summary, is we have to have an orderly transition for these sorts of changes. Yeah. There's a strong role for government, there's a strong role for regulators, and we have built the foundations of that on the back of this switch. The importance of outreach has been critical. I mean, I myself have written to, over 100 and how many?
You wrote 102 letters.
102 letters to different organisations, industry groups, government agencies at state and Commonwealth level. We've participated in national coordination mechanism meetings. The team has had weekly meetings with the telecommunications companies, and that is a role for government to raise awareness right up until the last minute, ensuring that people are doing what they're doing. And then finally, on that information awareness point, the real benefit we got from Telstra and Optus investing in a public awareness campaign that included television towards the end, because of those people who might be vulnerable and they might be watching TV, and that's the only way they're going to learn that their unmonitored medical device might not work as part of this switch. So the awareness campaign is really important. So I think there's some of the lessons. We're still working through some of those issues. So, for example, we now have a device testing process that the government's invested in with the University of Technology Sydney, which we can talk more about, which goes to that point about all these different mobile phones. We have ACMA working on a code with industry, and we have the 000 requirements, and it's ongoing.
Well, that's a great answer. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. I'll go to Senator Roberts next.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for appearing. Sad we didn't catch up last week, but anyway, we're back. So I want to thank the Chair and the Secretariat for that. Mr Chisholm, do you have any idea of the cost to consumers of the transition?
The cost of the transition?
To consumers.
We haven't modelled any costs.
What about the costs of new devices?
And we haven't modelled that either.
Lisa Rance, Senator Roberts, some of that cost will have been offset by the mobile network operators who, in evidence last week, were talking about the numbers of free devices that they have provided as well.
Excuse me, Ms Rance. I was conned by that as well. When I walked out of the room later, I found out that someone with a $1,000 special purpose phone with proper connections and proper protections, because they're a builder and construction, got a cheapy $40 phone. That's hardly comparable. That means that person's out $1,000. That's what I'm talking about. Any idea of the cost to the consumers?
No, we haven't modelled the costs, as Mr Chisholm said.
The key thing from our point of view is that ensuring that consumer received a phone that would work and could make, for example, 000 calls. That's a fundamental consideration for the government.
Well, I accept that, Mr Chisholm, but what about the out-of-pocket expenses? What about the tailoring of a phone that has major portion of and major role in people's lives, and then that phone is no longer available? Look at the on-cost. What I'm saying is not only the cost of a new device, but the costs of all the things that are going to go wrong in the meantime.
Yeah, I mean, I would strongly encourage any consumer in a situation where they have a device that's of a certain value, and which is really important to them, to make strong representations to their MNO about what the replacement device should be in their mind. But I see that as a matter between the consumer and their provider.
We had an example in the hearing last week. I think you were listening because I saw you when I walked out, so there was some mistake there.
Yeah.
Gulai, or some town in New South Wales.
Gulai?
Was it Gulai?
Yep.
Yeah. Potentially a life was lost as a result of the transition. Potentially. I'm not saying it was, because we haven't got the details.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, we are aware of the tragic incident that occurred in Gulai last year. Telstra notified the department and we asked for a report to be provided. That report advised that 8 calls were made to 000. 5 calls successfully connected to 000, and emergency services were called to the scene. The report advises that 3 of those calls there was not sufficient signal strength to reach, but 5 calls were successful. The report was also provided to the ACMA, and the ACMA, as the regulator, is undertaking some preliminary inquiries, further preliminary inquiries in relation to that very sad incident.
So what I'm getting at is that there's the cost to the consumer of replacing a device that is way beyond $40, $50 for a phone. Then the additional costs of losing business or whatever due to that loss. Then there's a potential loss of life. And yet you don't have any modelling on the cost.
Senator Roberts, can I? Sorry, Mr. Chisholm.
I was just going to say, I think, without wishing to add much more to Ms Sparreboom's answer, it is being investigated, the circumstances.
I meant the whole cost, Mr. Chisholm.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole cost, that would be a difficult exercise to try and model the cumulative costs for every consumer and their different devices and the replacement cost for equivalent devices with their provider.
Well, doesn't that indicate to you, it certainly does to me, that there was not a real handle on what was involved in the shutdown?
Well, it comes
the impact
back...
on... And this is a cost of living crisis that Australians are going through right now.
Yes,
one of the worst ever, and you don't have any data?
I think in that context, Senator, the provision of affordable handsets and devices to consumers is critical, which was the commitment that the MNOs made, and they have delivered on the provision of devices in hardship circumstances to consumers. And, Senator, on the question you ask about the government's commitment, its fundamental commitment, as I said before, has been public safety, hence the focus on 000, and also in relation to the case you mentioned before, the utmost seriousness with which that is being considered. But that has been at the centre of our efforts from day one on this.
I accept that on the cost of lives, but I'm talking about the cost of living now.
Yep.
And there was no handle on that. How many people or devices were actually disconnected on Monday, the 28th of October, and since the blocking rules have come into force?
We'll just get those numbers for you, Senator. Can I just add to Ms Sparreboom's answer, in following up on the very tragic incident in Goolai, my understanding from discussions with Telstra is that the 5 calls that got through, some of those were made possible through improvements to the 4G coverage.
Thank you, Ms Lawrence. As I explained to Mr Chisholm, I'm concerned about the cost to consumers in terms of dollar costs, inconvenience costs, during a cost of living crisis. We've just put a massive burden on people whose phones no longer work for their business and devices. Sorry,
Senator, we've got the numbers of 3G devices that were still active at the end of the shutdown period.
So throughout the last year, we received fortnightly reporting on the number of devices that would be on the networks that would be affected by the 3G shutdown. The last suite of numbers were on the 21st of October 2024, so a little bit before device blocking commenced. In total, the estimated devices on the 21st of October that would have been blocked was around 276,000 devices. And given that there are, in the order of 28 million devices, I think that demonstrates that there was a lot of people had the right device and that was not needed to be blocked, but also there was a significant effort to bring the number of devices down before the blocking commenced.
So what is the total number of devices? 21 million, did you say?
I think there are around 28 million devices.
Thank you. Why have the providers, Telstra and Optus, blocked customers with compatible 4G devices that are on the official support list and that were working perfectly prior to the Monday of the block?
The focus was around ensuring that those devices could call 000, and if that could not be substantiated, then some of those devices might be in that category. Mr Grunhard can probably expand on the blocking if that's useful.
So, Senator, yes, there was a particular focus on devices that, while they were functioning perfectly well on the 4G network, there's a small subset of older devices that we knew, we had discovered through this process, would be unable to make 000 calls following the closure of the 3G network. So the Minister took a very clear position, and she stated this publicly, that it was unacceptable for people to walk around with a phone in their pocket that they believed to be functioning normally and effectively, but would not work in the case of an emergency when they need to call 000. So I think that's the particular subcategory of devices you're referring to. The government took a very strong view that if the phone was not going to be able to call 000, even if it was otherwise working, that it was essential that that phone be blocked to force customer action onto a device that would work for 000.
And there were customers who, post the transition, went to make phone calls and found they didn't work. But that then triggered them calling their provider, who was able to say, you need to change your phone because you need to be able to make a 000 call. And that these were customers for whom the awareness campaign may not have reached, or there were customers, according to some of the research that we saw, who were prepared to wait until the transition actually happened and then upgrade their device. Yeah.
Who initiated the emergency calling services determination? Was that the Minister or ACMA?
Minister.
That's what I thought. That's what ACMA said. Were we told, not by you but by ACMA, that the shutdown wouldn't affect obligations on Telstra's telcos' obligations on the 000 calling? And just a new determination comes out that gives the telcos cover to just completely block any mobiles that might mean they're in breach of the determination. Why did that happen?
So, Senator, I think what the ACMA in their evidence said was that the emergency call service determination has in fact been in place for many years. It's the fundamental underpinning regulation that requires the telcos to make sure that 000 calls work. So that's a long-standing piece of regulation. What the Minister did in August last year was issue a series of directions to the ACMA to make changes to that pre-existing emergency call service determination to deal with the matters we've just been discussing, to ensure that any phones that would be unable to make 000 because of the 3G shutdown post the transition would need to be blocked to make sure that customers made the transition to a 000 capable device. So the Minister issued directions to the ACMA to update that determination that had been in place for a long time.
Didn't the Minister just let the telcos off the hook? Rather than make sure coverage was adequate, they just cut off all devices that didn't work?
So, Minister,
because we asked about this in the previous inquiry, that it seemed to us that we weren't ready for the shutdown.
So, Senator, as we just said, the Minister made very clear public statements that she wasn't prepared to have people walking around with devices that wouldn't be able to call 000. That was an important intervention for public safety. All consumers.
Why didn't she delay the shutdown?
Senator, I guess the broader context here to keep in mind as well is, so we've had the discussion about the coverage maps and the commitments that the MNOs have made, which in fact are larger, broader than what was covered by 3G and stronger in terms of being better capable of dealing with data and video and other content. 3G is really good for voice and text, but it's not so good for the services that all consumers want from their phones now, and hence the spectrum that is available using 4G and 5G is better suited to what consumers are telling us that they want from their devices. But the spectrum is a property right of the MNOs. They acquire it and they own it. And when industry in any context says that they are going to transition their property right, there is a role for government here, and the role for government is to ensure that public safety is met as a paramount consideration, and that there are regulatory arrangements in place to ensure that when that transition occurs, consumers' expectations are being met. So hence we've made the point here today and would continue to make it to all consumers that they should, as a first recourse, take up their concerns directly with their providers. And then if they are not satisfied with the answer they are getting, there are agencies who can assist them resolve complaints. And the Minister herself has continued a monitoring regime to ensure that complaints are being adequately addressed, that the data is being provided to government. But this is not a transition that the government is doing as part of something that it owns itself. The spectrum is something that the industry owns, and so government has a role to play with regulation. Hence, we now have regulations in place that were not there 6 months ago. They weren't there 2 years ago, 3 years ago, but the Minister has imposed very strong regulation coming out of this experience. And we will continue to look at whether that regime needs to be strengthened over time because, as I said before, this was a transition that needs to be handled in an orderly way, and that's our focus.
That's my focus too, and it's been that focus for 12 months now. I'd like to ask a question about compatibility and standardisation, which came out of the last inquiry. It's a serious issue. Before doing so, I just want to mention that no one in the world is doing what we've done. We're being held up as an idiot on the world stage. Swedish providers are delaying their shutdown for 2 years until 2027. Telia in Estonia is committing to keeping 2G available until 2029. In December 2024, Netherlands announced a 2-year delay to their 2G shutdown. The United States still has its 2G network going. In October 2024, Germany delayed their 2G shutdown by 3 years. And we understand from the last inquiry, we discussed the fact that Britain and France have delayed their 3G shutdown until about 2028. So the other point, as I said, was that we learned about the lack of compatibility and standardisation between the telcos and the apparent blocks to use of other telcos' phones on each network. What are you doing to make sure that that is rectified so that phones are compatible on both networks and standardisation occurs? Because that was a major finding from France and Britain, apparently.
Yeah, so we can
it's costing consumers a lot of money.
We can talk about device testing. We might also want to come back on some of the characterisation you made about what countries are doing, Senator, because I think the stories that the transition is happening in countries, including the United States. There is still some provision for 3G, but it's very small.
Just a small provision for 2G. They've switched off 3G.
3G's been switched off. There's a small provision for 2G, and that is a system and a market that is much more similar to Australia than a number of the countries you've mentioned. But on device testing, Mr. Grunhard can speak about that.
Senator, so your question about compatibility of devices, you're right. It's absolutely essential that devices be able to call across networks, particularly in the case of 000 calls. That is a regulatory requirement. However, the Bean review into the Optus outage of November 2023 exposed some significant weaknesses in that cross-network compatibility. For that reason, that review made recommendations which the government and the Minister accepted. The Minister directed the ACMA to introduce new provisions into the emergency call service determination that will now require, there will be mandatory device testing regime established. Those rules will be in place by 30th of April this year. And the department has contracted the University of Technology Sydney, as Mr. Chisholm mentioned earlier, to establish a controlled test facility in Sydney that the three networks will be required to use to test their devices in a whole range of failure scenarios to make sure that no matter what goes wrong on the day, 000 calls will be able to be carried. So that they'll be required to test at that facility that the department has contracted the UTS to establish.
Thank you. I'll just take you back to Mr. James Parker's submissions I think he's put in 2, maybe a supplementary, a third one. But he's also given testimony, witness statements. And we understand there's a deliberate blockage between telcos and deliberately blocking each other
Senator Roberts,
off.
we're going to lose quorum here. Just Senator Brown, before you go, just wondering, did you want to come back?
Well, I'll put on notice if
Okay. Senator Roberts?
If they could take that question on notice.
Okay, take it on notice, and I'm going to have some other questions on notice too, but we might wrap it up there because we're at our time anyway. So, look, thank you very much for that. I have to go quickly too, but we will get you those questions on notice today, and if you could get back to us by Friday the 14th of February, that'd be great. Thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day. I adjourn the committee. Thank you.